Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to thank you so much for being here tonight. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to the Baker Institute Student Forum. My name is Danny Cohen. I'm a sophomore here, and I'm the student event coordinator. So all of this, I've gotten a lot of help, but this has kind of been what I've been working on for the last year. And again, I'm so thankful you're all here to share it with me. So tonight's event is called Forging a More Civil Democracy, a discussion of faith, values, and politics, or what I describe as the things we can never talk about. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce two very reputable, very prestigious men. But before I do that, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of the individuals and the organizations who are responsible for this happening. We have some incredible people who donated their time and their funds to help me ensure that we could bring Reverend Wallis here. And I just direct you to the program to look all those individual names and organizations up. Without them, this really cannot have been possible, and I cannot be appreciative enough of that. I'd also like to thank Christine Kimmel and Melissa Llewellyn for spending countless hours with me this summer and last semester and this semester, just hammering out the details and making sure this event would go very smoothly. Again, I could not have done that without them. Before I introduce these two incredible men who, again, both of them, their reputations precede them, I'd like to tell you just a very brief story. I matriculated here at Rice a year ago, and I entered the Baker Institute for the first time just over a year ago. And the first time I ever came here, I went to a Baker Institute Student Forum meeting. And at that meeting, Rice alumna Lauren Baba told me that if you have an idea for an event, if you have an idea for a speaker, please tell us, and we'll try to get it done. And that sounded really good to me. So I said, okay. Bright-eyed freshman, didn't know what I was doing. I said, I have an idea. Let's bring Reverend Jim Wallis to campus. In 1 year, many trials, false starts, mistakes, and the hard work of so many people, and I am proud to say that he is clearly here before you and going to share this night with us. Tonight's moderator, again, a man who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway, is the distinguished Dr. Bill Martin. Dr. Martin is the Harry and Hazel Chavon Professor of Religion and Public Policy here at the Rice University Sociology Department, as well as the Chavon Senior Fellow for Religion and Public Policy here at the Institute. This man specializes in religion, criminology, and issues related to drug use and drug policy. He's been a professor here since 1968. Dr. Martin earned his Bachelor of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, as well as his PhD from Harvard. Not too bad, not too bad. He's appeared on 60 Minutes, and he's the author of With God on Our Side, The Rise of the Religious Right in America, and A Prophet with Honor, the Billy Graham Story, which was regarded as the most authoritative biography of the famed evangelist. When I told my mother that Dr. Bill Martin was going to be the moderator, she went, "Wait, is that the man who wrote the Billy Graham biography? I love that guy." I said, okay, yeah, she is. So again, Dr. Bill Martin, it's such an honor to have you with us. And tonight's special guest is Reverend Jim Wallis, the president and CEO of Sojourners, a progressive Christian organization with a widely circulated publication of the same name. Again, Reverend Wallis has been involved in so much. If I had to tell you them all, I think we'd be here all night. So I just try to pick the highlights. Reverend Wallis has been a champion for social justice since the early 1960s when he joined the civil rights movement and anti-war demonstrations. He's a best-selling author, public theologian, a speaker, and an international commentator on ethics and public life. He recently served on the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and currently serves as the chair of the Global Agenda Council on Faith for the World Economic Forum. He is the author of Rediscovering Values, On Wall Street, Main Street, and Your Street, A Moral Compass for the New Economy, as well as the New York Times bestsellers The Great Awakening, Reviving Faith and Politics in Post-Religious Right America, and one of my personal favorite books, and one that's been very influential, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. As part of his and Sojourners' mission to articulate the biblical call to social justice, and as Washington's debated deficit reductions and debt ceilings, Sojourners was advocating the importance of a moral budget that serves the most vulnerable in our nation and the most vulnerable around the world. Reverend Wallis has appeared on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and he currently teaches a course on faith, social justice, and public life at Georgetown University. He previously taught at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Jim Wallis.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the Baker Institute. I always love places where we talk about public policy. The county school at Harvard, I was often doing it there, and the Humphrey School in Minneapolis just there last week, and glad to be here. So thanks to the Bakers and all of you who make that possible. And Danny, I love young leaders who get things done. There you go. Or people will tell you, I read your book in the 7th grade. I love to hear that. There you go. And Bill Martin I have admired for so long. We got just talking about Billy Graham and our sort of conversations and stories with him. But I did know you were an expert in religion and criminology. And I wondered sitting there how the two are often connected. Our topic tonight, of course, is about policy, but faith and values and politics. These are the taboo subjects. You don't talk about religion and politics at polite dinner parties. And they're very scary, particularly as elections are coming on. But I've made my life of trying to connect these two. And I've noticed how confusing these topics often are. Religion is, honestly, a very confusing subject. Like, my son Luke, who's now 13, when he was about 7, came up to Joy and I one night and says, Dad, I'm worried about Max and Jonah, the two of the little guys on his baseball team that I get to coach, as a Little League baseball coach. I don't think they believe in God or Jesus. I think they're vegetarians. So we had to take Luke out to, Oregon, where he'd meet some godly vegetarians, and that seemed to satisfy him. But at a deeper level, I remember the first time I was on the Jon Stewart Daily Show, and had a great time with John, and who I think is I tell him he's a kind of modern-day Hebrew prophet. He uses humor and satire and truth in the way that he says, no, I'm just a comic from the Borscht Belt. But I remember the emails I got afterwards. John has a very young demographic for his audience. So I got these emails by the thousands afterwards. And I would say things like, I lost my faith because of television preachers, bad religious fundraising, pedophile priests, cover-up bishops, White House theology. Or they said, to my amazement, I didn't know you could be a Christian and care about poverty, or care about the environment, or care about the war in Iraq. But when they heard that you could, they get very excited. I meet them in airports and their busboys in hotels, and even on the street they would stop me and we'd talk. And I remember at the Days Inn one day in my hometown of Detroit, this young 19-year-old desk clerk says, oh, Reverend Wallis, we're so glad you're here at the Days Inn. You have an upgrade. An upgrade at the Days Inn. These are the moments you live for on the road, of course. And I said, well, how did I get the upgrade? She says, well, I watched Jon Stewart. I read your book. It was awesome. So it's confusing. But what I like about the new generation that I get to talk to all the time, on the road now, our audiences are about half under 30 almost every time. Half of them under 25 almost every time. And I'm talking literally every week to teenagers about what they want their faith to mean and their lives to make a difference in the world. And I love that. So I think a new generation is really helping to clear up the confusion about what it means to be a person of faith. we can talk more about that. So I'm going to just say a few things, and then Bill and I are going to just talk back and forth, which will be more fun than talk to you for a while back and forth. A friend of mine who I had lecture for me at Georgetown this week works in Chicago, works in one of the poorest neighborhoods, all poor, all minority. And he said, if you work with the poor, live with the poor, you inevitably run into injustice. Inevitably. In other words, poverty isn't an accident. There are unjust systems and structures that create and perpetuate human suffering. And to change injustice, you have to deal with public policy. So it's good that we're talking about this here tonight. William Wilberforce, who is a hero among many evangelicals like me, who was the British parliamentarian that proposed the end of the slave trade. First time he raised that in the parliament, he was laughed at. 30 years later, when slavery was abolished in Britain, he got a standing ovation. And he died 5 days later because his work was done. He never said it's okay for British Christians, perhaps, to release their slaves. That wouldn't be enough. You had to end the slave trade, he said. And that took politics. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. never said, if just all the people of faith would just not discriminate, we'd be fine. He said, no, we need a civil rights law in 1964. And voting rights in 65, you have to change systems, structures, habits, attitudes, behaviors. We had a session just before this with some students, and I said, the question came up about the role of social justice and what it was. And I said, the Bible reveals a God of justice, not simply a God of charity. I mean, look at the prophets, the Hebrew prophets. Look who their targets were. They were princes, rulers, landlords, judges, employers. They were those in charge of things. Who were their subjects? Widows, orphans, the poor, the oppressed, workers, debtors, those on the wrong end of unjust judicial decisions. And what were their topics? Land, labor, capital, wages, debt, institutional relationships. The stuff of politics is discussed probably at this place all the time. I think politics, as I said to the students, is not really just about Washington, or candidates in the election will say that it is. Lately, I've been thinking about a term. One of my colleagues in a meeting one day said, post-candidate advocacy, post-candidate politics. And what he got me thinking about was that change never originates in places like Washington. It arrives there sometime after things change, the conversation changes. In Washington, D.C., you're always aware of how you're dealing with decisions, but decisions are finally impacted by the conversation. You can't change the public policy decisions until you change the public conversation about something. So when people come to Washington to lobby, I often am asked to speak to them before they go up on the Hill. And I say, I want you not to waste your valuable time talking to the wrong people. So let me describe how you recognize a member of Congress. They're the ones who are dressed in ties and shirts and suits, and they're walking around Capitol Hill. You can always spot them because they have their fingers in the air. And then you'll see them lick their finger and hold up, see which way the wind is blowing. And we think we can change a nation by electing one wet-fingered politician to replace another. But Wilberforce knew, and King knew, and Gandhi knew, and all the great leaders of movements knew, change a nation, you don't just replace one wet-fingered paw with the other. You've got to change the wind. Change the wind, and it's amazing how quickly politics will change. Interestingly enough, almost every social reform movement, social change movement in our history, almost every one, has had religion, people of faith, spiritual values in the center of it. It's never just people of faith, ever, because religion has no monopoly on morality. I'm saying religion has no monopoly on morality. But no social movement has succeeded without the dynamic of religion, faith, spiritual values at the core. That's always been the way it is. I suspect it always will be. Let me just say briefly, and then we'll go to our dialogue. We're in an election year. I wrote a piece today, a column. It's I think it's up on HuffPost by now, and it says a lot of folks having a problem with evangelicals already. It starts again in the election. And it seems to be a common agenda of the right and the left to say that all evangelicals are part of, well, this, they're all sort of intellectually flawed and have crazy ideas, and they're all dominionists who want to take over the country. I said, you know, I'm known by most to be a progressive political voice in America, and I am an evangelical Christian. How did this happen? And a new generation of evangelicals is naming climate change and energy and poverty and immigration reform and war and peace as biblically important issues. A new generation of young people, evangelicals in black and Hispanic churches, and a whole conversation is being missed by, as I said in the book, read out, the right gets it wrong, the left doesn't get it. It's still true. So that's going to create a whole firestorm. And today, just today, unbeknownst to me, on a TV show, it was said, evangelicals are antithetical to democracy. Interesting. To all the black church pastors that I know. The media will say the religion issues this year will be abortion, gay marriage, evolution, probably Mormonism, let me guess about that, and maybe how many Muslims a candidate might put in his or her cabinet. I want to say, no, the religious issues really should be things like the release of the census data just 3 weeks ago, saying there are 46 million people in this country now, almost 50 million of us, who are below the poverty line, which, remember, is $22,000 for a family of 4. Try to live on that for a while. 22% of all the children in the richest country in the world are poor. And here's a stat that they didn't tell you. 3/4 of them have jobs. Half work full-time, a quarter half-time, and only a quarter don't work. They have jobs that aren't good enough to support a family. They have jobs. Something is terribly wrong. I would suggest that's a religious issue. So on those who define this from the right, I'll say, how is it that that to be a Christian means to be pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American? How did this happen to us? Or on the left, that any conversation about faith is a violation of church and state. I want to suggest to you tonight that the separation of church and state, which I believe in, does not mean the segregation of moral values from public life. Martin King did it best. Bible in one hand, Constitution in the other. He never said that he got to win because he was a Christian in a then Judeo-Christian country. He said he knew he had to win the debate about what was best for the common good. Not just for black people, Baptists, Catholics, the religious. Why that Civil Rights Law and Voting Rights Act were good and necessary for this country, for the common good. We've had 3 battles at Sojourners over the years. The first was that faith was just private. That's what I was told growing up. It was just me and the Lord. That was about it. The world only came up when I was told not to be worldly, which meant not dancing in Detroit, which was impossible in Motown with Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross, and I couldn't do it. I was a failure at not being worldly. But now most believe that religion should have a public dimension. We've won that battle. With the whole movement, we won the battle. Second was what the issues were. And we said they can't just be abortion, gay marriage, and pornography. There is so much in the Bible about caring for and defending the poor. That had to be there. And so now I'll be debating this fall at the president of American Enterprise Institute, and he will agree that to be a Christian means to care for the poor. The third battle, though, is what kind of society is the good society? What does God want? The role of government, the market, the churches. Is there even such thing as the common good? Margaret Thatcher once said, there is no such thing as society, only individuals. Ayn Rand, who, as far as I know, was a Russian philandering atheist who hated Jesus, in her own words, is not very popular among evangelicals. Very interesting. The ethic of selfishness. The battle ahead for us is going to be seeking the common good in an age of selfishness. Common goods deep in Catholic social teaching, evangelical revivals, Protestant social gospel, Islam, Judaism, Ubuntu in Africa, and in our very democratic tradition in the Constitution itself. That'll be the battle in this election. It won't be talked about that way, but that is the battle in this election. What is the nature of the social compact, social contract? Is there even a social contract anymore at all? That's the nature of the battle now. So I like this conversation. I'm glad to be here. And I'm particularly happy that there's a lot of young people out here tonight, because if I get to call on people to ask questions, they'll be the first that I call upon, because they're the ones who are defining a new ethic for politics that comes right from their own sense of faith and their moral compass. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Our Reverend Wallis, you can call me Dr. Bill. We can just share prove our joint humility here. I want to join in the welcome for you, and also the thanking of the Baker Institute Student Forum for the terrific job they've done for this, but also the terrific job they're doing as the real addition they make, not only to the campus at large, but to the Baker Institute. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be able to work with them. We have a good crowd tonight. We often don't draw this many people, even for dictators. So you can we not only have this room full, but the room behind us is full, and I'm told that there are some churches that are joining together and watching it on the webcast. So we welcome all those people out in internet land and the sick and the shut-ins as well. I know that you are a baseball fan from reading that comes up in your books, and I want you. This is a special day and a blessed, happy day for Astros fans. The season ended yesterday. And I know it's not quite as good for Red Sox fans, but my son, who's an avid Red Sox fan, said yesterday, if your team's playing meaningful games in September, it's been a good year. So you can go with that. You mentioned about how do I mix criminology and religion and how do those fit, and I get asked that a lot, but Danny mentioned that I also direct the drug policy program here, and it certainly comes to play there. When you think that we have far more people in prison than any other country in the world, either by numbers or rates, we outstrip China, which is second by a good bit. And a great many of those people are in prison because of drug offenses. And I think that when I think as a Christian that John the Baptist, Jesus, Peter, Paul, all died in custody on unjustifiable charges. They fit together pretty well. I want to check on your credentials now. You have said in a number of times that you're not a liberal. Is that you're not a liberal evangelical, but a progressive evangelical?
Yeah, what I said today in this column was I've got many friends in the liberal churches, but I'm more theologically conservative. And I've got a lot of allies on the religious left, but I'm really not part of that. It's because, for a lot of us, it's because we're Bible-believing and Jesus-following that we say that a society is most, its integrity is most defined by how it treats the poorest and most vulnerable. My views about the poor and poverty and creation care and war and peace all come from my evangelical faith, and because I'm primarily, first of all, a member of the global body of Christ, I'm first a member of that, and only secondly, an American. And the gospel has never coexisted well with empires. So my political ethic really stems from that sort of Bible-believing, Jesus-following identity that I was, grew up in a long time ago.
Well, I want to check you on how serious you are about the Bible, because I have heard that it's been said that you have said the Bible's full of holes. Do I have that right?
Well, there's this famous story you apparently heard about. When we were in seminary, I was kicked out of my little church at 15, 16 over the issue of race. They said, I'm in Detroit, and I'm realizing as a kid, I'm now hearing the news and reading the papers and just paying attention to my city, and something felt terribly wrong. Way we lived in white Detroit and how life seemed so different in black Detroit. So an elder one day said, Jim, you have to understand, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. And our faith is personal. And that's the night that I left in my head and my heart, and I was just gone. I didn't have words to go around that, but later I found them, and they'd be these words: God is personal, but never private. Okay? So then I went to student movement and got, we could put 10,000 people in the street in 2 hours' time at Michigan State, tear gassed, beat up, put in jail, more times than I can count. And then I came back to the New Testament on my own and then back to faith. And I could have chosen to go to Union Seminary, where they agreed with me about Vietnam. But I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School to have an argument with my tradition. So in the first few weeks, we did a study, this is a group of us, of the Bible. to find every single reference to the poor. Every single one. We found more than 2,000 verses in the Bible about the poor. Poverty, wealth, poverty. So one of my colleagues thought he'd try an experiment. He took a Bible, old Bible, and a pair of scissors, and he began to cut out of the Bible every single text about the poor. Just cut it right out. The prophets were decimated. You know, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Mary's wonderful Magnificat, the Sermon on the Mount, Luke 4, Jesus' opening mission statement, all gone. And when he was done, that Bible was literally full of holes. It was falling apart in my hands. It was in shreds. And I'd take it out to preach. I would say, brothers and sisters, this is the American Bible. It's full of holes. From all we've paid no attention to, ignore, we might as well, all of us, get our scissors out and begin to cut. So a couple years ago, that story got around to the British Bible Society and World Vision, who've now published, you can get this on Amazon, the Poverty Bible. They picked up all the texts from the cutting room floor, put them back into the Bible, and underscored them in World Vision orange so you can't miss them. And that's what I mean when I say a whole new generation, really, I think, are putting their Bibles back together again when they care about inner city poverty or global human trafficking. There are more women and children in slavery now globally than when Wilberforce freed the slaves 200 years ago. And that's a frontline issue for a whole new generation of evangelicals. So it's really putting our Bibles back together again, that and you can just now buy the Poverty Bible. You know?
I'm glad I asked. You mentioned in your talk about the recent census, the report on the census data on poverty. I'll just give a plug here for Jim's book, Rediscovering Values, which will be available for you. You could have gotten it outside or be available in the lobby afterwards. We'll say more about that in a moment. But I was touched very much by reading, you're talking about going up to bed with your sons in the evening for their prayers. And one of the boys, Jack, said in one of the prayers, and God, there are a lot of poor people, hungry people, and homeless people. Any comments or questions? Amen. And he was Jim said that he's used to interactive classroom, and he wanted to know what God thought about there being so many poor people out there. And then another son, Luke, had heard that 30,000 children die every day from hunger and disease. And his prayer was, dear God, I pray that all those children won't die again tomorrow, but that's unlikely. So, dear God, I pray that it will be their best day ever, but that's stupid. So, dear God, help us to stop this from happening. So, the question I want to ask is, how do we do that? How do we, what is the role of the faith community here? And you've spoken about it some, but on your website you have something called the circulate, or the circle of protection. Would you comment on that?
The only area of growth in this economy is the poverty rate. Nothing else is growing, but that's growing. That's not just a moral problem and a religious issue. I'm the chair of the Global Action Council on Values for the World Economic Forum of Davos. And we had a call yesterday morning, and these are CEOs all over the world, and they think it's a problem. And the IMF last month did a study showing that inequality is a hindrance to economic growth. Okay? That many people poor, and globally, as Luke, my son Luke, knows, is much worse. I mean, 27,000 kids dying every day because of utterly preventable disease and what Bono calls stupid poverty is an indictment. 3 billion of, I teach at Georgetown, and these are like smart kids, Georgetown. I know Rice is the Harvard of the South. I know that, but these are smart kids too. And when I do the poverty stats every year, I didn't know that. I had no idea. 3 billion people, half the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. That political fact is the most important global statistic in the world. It affects everything else, and we never talk about it as if it's relevant. It is relevant, not just morally, but in terms of stability, national security, and everything else. So, but now we're reduced to, in a CNN candidate forum during the election, I stood to ask candidate Obama a question. I said, Senator, would you commit this nation to try and cut poverty in half in 10 years? And candidate Obama said, well, Jim, he said, couldn't do it alone. It'll take the faith community and all of us working together, but yes, that's a goal that we should pursue. That kind of talk is now a joke in Washington, D.C. The best we can do is form what the faith community has, we call it a circle of protection around the poorest and most vulnerable, and the programs, the ones that are the most impactful on them, in a climate where they're in jeopardy. And so the Catholic bishops, of course, they're members of the religious left, and the National Association of Evangelicals, again, far left group, the Salvation Army, we're all at the table across from the president and his economic team saying deficits are moral issues. I want to make that clear. I am for reducing the deficit, but how you reduce it and who pays for that is also a moral issue. And when we have reduced deficit before, and it's in Simpson Bowles, it's in Gang of Six, the principle was you exempt the poorest and most vulnerable, because that's not where the money is anyway. But they're the ones who don't have the resources to defend themselves. So when President Obama mentioned maybe we should consider cutting those deductions for corporate, private corporate jets, within 48 hours, it was a New York Times article, corporate jet industry mobilizes. Because they did. 3 pharmaceutical lobbyists for every member of Congress. No K Street firms that I know of have widows and orphans as clients. So the deficit, half of it, just the demographics, half the deficit was 2 wars not paid for, and the Bush tax cuts. That's half, right there. And what I've tried to say is this really isn't just scarcity, it's choices. For example, if we had a national debate and forum and I was to say $8.5 billion is being slated to be cut for low-income housing, we're keeping $8.4 billion for deductions on second vacation homes. That's a housing choice. $2.5 billion is being cut from home heating oil assistance to low-income families. I mean, it's cold in the winter, at least some places, not here. 2.5 billion. Also, we're cutting the home heating oil, keeping offshore drilling subsidies for oil companies making record profits. The same amount of money. These are choices. So we're saying that don't choose to cut those who have no defense for themselves. We're not saying every program that's called a poverty program is effective. We're saying if they're not, change them, reform them, make them better. We're also saying jobs and growth are the key to the future. But we're saying when you cut, don't cut the poorest people. And that's been a consistent message, and we have been able in the first round to save some things that otherwise would have already been gone. But now we face the second round. If you know what's happening in D.C., they're going to cut $1.2 trillion. And all I'm saying is, let's reduce the deficit in a balanced way that doesn't increase poverty, which I think makes sense.
One more question here, and then we want to go to the other question. You mentioned Ayn Rand. I think you have made a very strong case that people as part of faith communities should stand for the poor, should try to deal with poverty. But why should a person not follow the Ayn Rand approach of the virtue of selfishness or rational self-interest? What about just leaving it to the market's magic invisible hand, which produces the greatest good for the most people? I mean, are you against markets, or why should a non-believer in any religion want to deal with poverty?
Right. They don't normally make someone chair of a Davos council if they're against markets. I was at Davos for several years, and they would put people like me and Muhammad Yunus at 7 a.m. on the 4th floor, and 30 other nonprofit types would come and we'd talk together in a small circle. Until there was this crisis in 2008. 2009, there was a plenary session called Values in the Market. Prime time, Davos. And now we're on the main floor. And I just simply said, we've heard of Adam Smith's invisible hand. But what do you do when the invisible hand lets go of the common good? What happens then? Adam Smith, in his prior book to The Wealth of the Nations, called The Moral Sentiments, says that moral sensibilities are crucial to the functioning of the market. Joseph Schumpeter, again, the defender of capitalism, says, without ethical sensibilities, the market will end up devouring everything and finally even itself. And I now talk to CEOs who come and talk to me like Nicodemus at night about how it's worse than what I said in the book about what's happening inside Citibank or Goldman Sachs. So, or as Elizabeth Warren, who she comes from a mixed marriage, she says, from Arkansas, Methodist and Baptist, and is a Methodist Sunday school teacher. She said, from the Code of Hammurabi, we had usury laws from the Code of Hammurabi to 1980. And so the market is good at some things, and that's why I'm not, as Glenn Beck suggests, a communist. But the market is not good at necessarily taking care of looking after the common good. So right now, the conversations I'm having with CEOs, yesterday on the phone, they were talking about how do you replace an ethic of endless growth with an ethic of sustainability? How do we talk about the common good, the social contract, the social compact, transparency? So I think it's a new conversation about what I'd call the three-legged stool. How do you, the market is one leg of that stool, and then the public sector, the government, and then the whole civil society. My sector is a civil society, faith community. That's where, I think that's where leadership often comes from. But there's, in New Orleans, the faith community was more effective, more timely, was on the spot. Government at all levels failed, but churches can't rebuild levees or provide health care for all the folks who don't have it. All the feeding, I have fought for years on behalf of feeding hungry people. All the programs, all the congregations, all the synagogues, all the mosques, all the food banks, all the soup kitchens provide right now for 6% of the need of hunger in America, 6%. So you've got to do partnership, three-legged stool, but I think there's conversation now on all three sectors of how we do that effectively.
Well, we are going to go to questions now. I do want to mention to you, give a plug. I was going to ask you about this, but I'll just give it a plug. On January the 25th in the afternoon here, we're going to have a symposium that will last several hours on the projected role of religion in the 2012 elections. And we'll be talking about a number of things with some very excellent speakers, people who study this. John C. Green, who you name, you'll see in the paper, probably the premier person that studies religion and politics from analyzing polls and the like. And the returning Michael Lindsay, who's been a member of our sociology department here for several years and now gone to be president of Gordon College, and also the columnist Leonard Pitts. So it's going to be quite an
I want to come.
Quite an afternoon.
That sounds like fun.
So, if you will, we've taken a little bit more time than we were supposed to, but we were just having fun. So, if you want to come to either one of the microphones here, we are limited in time. So, if you have a question, come to it. Brief, one question, and not a speech, and we'll be happy. And if you're a young person, you will even have a better chance of being recognized. So, yes.
Hi, we appreciate you coming. I'm a master's student in the Department of Architecture here, but I just wanted to hear you speak more about your experiences and the effects of your hunger strike, if that's all right.
Last spring, we had this budget debate coming up, and we weren't getting any traction at all. We coined a phrase a few years ago saying a budget is a moral document. And that wasn't getting any traction at all. So it was Lent, and I remember I was on the phone with Tony Hall, who was the U.S. ambassador to the U.S. Food Program in Rome and before the member of Congress. And Tony said, I think fasts can unleash God. I thought, that sounds like pretty good to me. So I couldn't do much else, but I thought at least I could stop eating. So in Lent, we did that. So Tony and I did a water fast for 7 days, and then just added orange juice for another 30 days altogether. And we didn't know what would come of it. Maybe just our own clarity, our own deeper reflection, more time to pray, more time to think about this. But 40,000 people joined the fast. 30 members of Congress did relay fasts. And then a lot of folks outside the faith community joined the fast, which I thought was very interesting. And it did finally get some attention to the issues, and CNN covered it and did a good story about it. And that helped to lead to what became the Circle of Protection after that. It was sort of, the faith community doing something that people of faith do. It's a discipline that we're used to called fasting. And for us, it was a clarifying kind of practice, and it led to what became the Circle of Protection.
I used to be young. I cherish
you can get over it.
Yeah. I cherish an old issue of Sojourners with Gordon and Mary Cosby on the cover. And I just would like to know of any relationship between Sojourners and Church of the Savior.
Well, Gordon Cosby has been a spiritual father and mentor to me for many years, and he became our prayer warrior in the fast. Gordon called and said, he's like in his 90s now. He says, "Don't have a lot to do anymore, so I just pray a lot." And one day he told me that he had created a version of the Jesus prayer for the fast, and he was doing it 100 times a day. That's when I began to feel like, there was some momentum here. He's involved in something called Christ House, which is a shelter for homeless, a medical clinic for homeless men. And they called me over there one day, and the homeless men at Christ House had raised $1,000 for the fast as homeless men. So Gordon really was, to me, the prayer warrior, the spiritual anchor to the fast, and he's been that for many years. Gordon Cosby, if you don't know him, Church of the Savior, the heart of it is the inward-outward journey. You can't be an activist for a long time unless you also become a contemplative. you'll burn out, you'll destroy yourself. But if you're a contemplative that doesn't really ever encounter the world, you'll miss something too. So the inward-outward journey that Gordon has preached for years, to me, is the center of the kind of movement we're trying to build. I don't want to see a bunch of political activists, but more spiritual activists, people who are doing this out of the depths of their faith, their spirituality, their moral compass. That's what I think has changed and will change the world.
I remember well having lunch with Gordon Cosby when he came to visit Harvard Divinity School in the early 60s, and it I could go into detail but won't, but it made a significant impact, and not just an impression, but an impact.
Here's the gospel. He knows the gospel so well. He told me the other day, he said, Tim, I'm enjoying dying. What a gospel thing to say. I'm enjoying dying. This is my last stage, and I'm really enjoying dying.
Yes.
My question involved, is there an inherent trade-off between economic freedom and social justice towards making sure that the poor have enough to eat and making sure they have an education and such? I would view that, of course, that there is a need to help the poor through private eleemosynary activities. But at the same time, the engine that has created the ability for us to help the poor is the free market, is freedom for people to pursue their own actions without the heavy hand of government weighing them down, so to speak. What are your views on that?
The problem with that just sounds like politics to me, because Muhammad Yunus, who I was on the floor with there, Bangladesh, Grameen Bank, they have engaged in micro-lending, and they lend mostly to women, and they have transformed their country, not philanthropy, but using business as a solution. He's in New York. He was in New York on Morning Joe the other day. They're now lending to 6,000 people in the Bronx. People who can't use the market. They can't get loans. They can't get any financial capital. And so the market is not fair. It's not structured to allow people to participate. The answer to poverty is for people to be able to lift themselves out of it. We're structured so that they can't. Mike Gerson wrote me today. He's a conservative Republican. He worked for George Bush. There's people around here that have worked for Bushes too. And Mike is talking about the need for an opportunity society. Social mobility in this country now is less than Europe. Social mobility, Mike Gerson says, and he's right, is less than Europe. So we want fairness. We want people to be able to, what we call education in inner cities is really criminal activity aimed at kids of color. It's criminal activity. The kids where I've lived most of my life, kids have no chance if they grew up in those schools, like I did. So let's talk about, and I'm talking all the time with people who are in the market, who are talking about, unless we talk about not just shareholders, but stakeholders, like workers, like consumers. Wealth doesn't trickle down, but bad values do. So we've got these maxims now. Greed is good. It's all about me, and I want it now. Those don't work. Better values are enough is enough. We're in this together. And I love the Native American notion. You evaluate decisions today by their impact on the seventh generation out. Now that's a whole different, so the old left-right, government can do it all, market can do it all. This is like Washington stupid talk. Let's talk about what's right and what works on the ground for all of us. And I wish we had time, but the notion of the common good is very powerful. In God's economy, two principles. There is enough if we share it. Now, E.J. Dionne wrote in the Post the other day about the common good. He says, do I want just more money for myself and my kids, or do I want them to grow up in a kind of society where there's a notion of the commons? and it's a good thing for them as well. So I think there's some place between the left-right sort of Washington stupid talk about what really can work, not just for the poor, but for all of us. And that's a conversation I want to have, whether in Houston or Davos or in the poorest neighborhoods of the country, where people don't want to be involved in government programs that don't work and just increase dependency. Nobody wants that. We want to invest in the physical, economic, and moral infrastructure of this nation, which are all crumbling right now.
Okay, we'll take just one more question here. Sorry, because I know there.
How about if we? Well,
okay.
How about if you all
ask?
Name your question one after the other?
All right.
And then we'll do a lightning round here.
Okay.
Yeah. Just name your question, or just say quickly. This doesn't allow time for speeches.
Which is the younger question, the younger person's question. My question is, I hear you saying so clearly that there is an evangelical force in this country that is not radical right, but we also know there is an evangelical force that is, and certainly in Texas we're intimately familiar with that, and have been living under it for many years. So can you talk about the impact that does have on policy and on the election?
My question is, what happens when religion can come into conflict on things like women's health and contraception, and what your response to that is?
The stupid talk in Washington comes because the candidates are forced to play to the more radical side of their parties to get the nomination in the first place. And then when they get in, they set up the gerrymandering so that they get reelected. Is there anything we can do to get somebody more middle of the road so we can put some values in with some economic sense?
Excuse me. I'm a first-year divinity student, and master's of divinity student, and Bible study leader. And in studying, recognizing all the passages kind of that you talk about helping out the poor, what could I tell my Bible study about putting feet to ground and something that they can literally do that they would feel would impact and have a serious, long-lasting impact, besides kind of the volunteerism that we do that seems to be more of a Band-Aid, kind of like what King talked about. How do we get beyond Band-Aid, which is necessary for now, to long-lasting? What could we do?
This ought to be pretty easy for you.
Yeah.
The lady over here touched on, it just seems to me there's an elephant in the room, and it's population control, and every time anybody brings it up, they're accused of genocide.
Okay, let me just, this will be very brief comments. I'm sorry they won't be in depth. But on that one, the answer to global poverty, let me be very simple, the answer to global poverty is fund women and girls. Fund women and girls. All the data shows that. When you invest in, fund, support women and girls, when you fund women as Muhammad Yunus showed, the Gates Foundation has showed, all the data shows, and give girls education. When you do that, you make tremendous progress. Look at Rwanda now, since the genocide. Now, we could have a whole conversation about that. Now, religion has too often been, hierarchical, patriarchal force that keeps that down. But I'm married to one of the first women ordained in the Church of England, Joy Carroll, and women priests. I know that battle well, and there's a whole kind of transformation going on, even in religion, about the role of women in the faith community. And we're going to have to get past all these hierarchical caps on the role of women, because the answer to global poverty is funding women and girls. We have a whole Sojourners project now going on about that. Now, candidates, what we need in Washington, D.C. is something called the Moral Center, which isn't sort of the extremes of both sides. If you watch, Bill O'Reilly and then Keith Olbermann, who's now, you finally get tired of the tone and the level of discourse going on. I think the country is not really with Fox or MSNBC. The country is in a different place, and almost never hear an articulation of their values. For example, and this gets to the poverty question here, there are three obstacles to really addressing poverty. One is the lack of priority for the poor. The poor don't vote generally or contribute to elections. They don't have any K Street lobbyists. They're not a priority. The White House won't talk about poverty out loud, not just the Republicans. Nobody will. Second is the poor are caught in the debate about poverty. Conservatives say a lot of smart things about poverty when they say, marriage is an anti-poverty measure. That's true. When you have 80% single-parent families like in my neighborhoods, you can't overcome poverty. Family, nurturing family, reweaving the fabric of life, family and village, parenting. I've never seen anyone escape poverty without a measure of personal responsibility. That is true. And the left is right about the lack of health care, the lack of jobs that pay living wages, no money for child care. There are systems and structures. Why do we make silly choices between the cultural dimension of poverty and the economic social structures that cause and perpetuate poverty? There is people on the ground know that you have to do economic development and reweave the bonds of family and community. It will happen last in D.C., though. That's where it happens last. The economic, the religious right, yes, there is a religious right. But every reporter that wants to write about this should have as required reading the new statement of the National Association of Evangelicals called The Healing of the Nations. And you'll see the biblical advancement of views on poverty, climate change, energy, war and peace, all the rest, that really dispel the notion that all evangelicals are part of the far right. There's a generational shift going on. There are, as I'd say, dominionists. There are people who want to take over the country and legislate Leviticus. But not most evangelicals. So that change of heart and mind and direction in a new generation is critical to our future. And finally, to the question about, King was killed defending garbage workers in Memphis. That's when he died. And he'd come a long way from I Have a Dream. And he was talking about a poor people's campaign. A poor people's campaign. And I think a new generation may be picking up the mantle of the poor people's campaign that was left and died in the mud of a Washington monsoon after King was killed. And that's the movement that I think is most hopeful to us now. In many faces, education, trafficking, housing, the empowerment of women, but that movement around the country, which starts with service, it does, but finally it gets to the why question. Why are these kids that I'm tutoring so poorly educated? Why is this family living in a homeless shelter? Why are people hungry when food's going to waste just a few blocks away? Domhilder Câmara, the Brazilian bishop, came to visit us one day and he said, when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint. When I ask why they're hungry, they call me a communist. I was on Glenn Beck's blackboard for a year just because we asked the question of why. Why is this going on? To ask the why question is to ask the justice question. And the good news is when people begin to just, go to New Orleans 47 times from one church and come back, it changes the church about how they think, about who they are, and they have been living in this bubble for so long that they haven't got a clue. When we break out of the bubbles of our lives and go where we're not supposed to be and cross those invisible signs that scream at you, no trespass. The beginning of everything for me was as a 14-year-old kid of going where I wasn't supposed to be and learning from what I saw there. And that was the beginning of everything else. And for most people I know, that's how it started for them too. So the problem with many of us is, you got to get out of the house more often.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me thank you all for coming, but particularly join with me in thanking the Reverend Jim Wallis for wonderful effort.